and welcome to Pedagogy in Practice. This official Old Dominion University podcast is jointly produced by the ODU Center for Faculty Development and the University Libraries. I'm your co-host, Tim Heckman, and I'm the Dean of Libraries here at ODU.
And I'm your co-host, Crystal Kinlock-Taylor, Educational Program Developer with the Center for Faculty Development. The purpose of this podcast is to highlight talented educators and innovative teaching practices among ODU faculty to create an engaged community of practice. With that in mind, we'd like to start with a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the co-hosts and our guests, and not of Old Dominion University.
Our guest today is Dr. Jay O'Toole. Dr. O'Toole is an associate professor and the PhD program coordinator in the Department of Management at ODU's Strome College of Business. He's a 2022 recipient of that college's Outstanding Teaching Award. His research and teaching focus on improvisation, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and Jay has strong interest in understanding how we can all work together to close the opportunity gap in the United States and beyond. Much of his research focuses on how teams and organizations can quickly coordinate collective action by leveraging knowledge-based resources. Prior to joining ODU, Jay has been an entrepreneur, he's been a consultant in the private sector, he's been a mathematics teacher with Teach for America, he's been the founder of a nonprofit organization, and he's taught at Elon University and Georgia State University. So quite a diverse resume. So welcome, Jay, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. It's nice being here.
Well, Jay, to get us started, who or what most shaped your approach to teaching and working with students?
I've always loved working with students. I think probably what shaped me most was my time teaching high school math in Greenville, Mississippi with Teach for America. The moment that I remember that is kind of stuck in my mind actually came before I moved to Mississippi, when I was interviewing teachers at my old high school and asking them for feedback and ideas. And I remember talking to Tom Bromley, who was Mr. Bromley, my physics teacher from high school. He was an amazing educator. And he was asking me, so why do you want to teach? Why are you moving to Mississippi? Why do you want to teach? And I remember giving a kind of response at the time. It didn't feel canned, but now in retrospect it does, which is, if I could just make the difference, in just one student's life, this would be worth it. It's a big deal. And he said straight faced to me, if that's all you do, you failed as a teacher. That is not what teaching is about. And he went on to explain that as an educator and as a teacher, it is your responsibility to teach all the students in the classroom. And and that's kind of the way he explained it, right? So if all you've done is made a difference in one child's life, think of all those other children in your classroom who have not benefited from your time there. And it really shaped my perspective on what I was to do in the classroom. Teach for America was an incredible experience. The training was as good as it could be, given that you're being thrust into a classroom with about 3 months of training. But what they did during the training is really help me understand that teaching is leadership. And if you walk into the classroom and you teach the whole child and you treat each student as an individual, they can achieve amazing things. And so during that time, I watched students come into my classroom. I taught all levels of math in high school, but typically my 8th and 9th graders were in algebra, or not 8th, 9th and 10th graders were in algebra. And they would walk into my room with, on average, a 5th grade math level. And so I had a lot of 9th and 10th graders who couldn't add -2 + 3. -2 + 3 was -5 to many of them. And watching them grow from that level to, and I'm proud to say that my students had the highest state test scores in Algebra 1 at the end of the year. And so just seeing the transformation of what's possible, knowing that all kids, I'll call them kids because I still call all my students kids, even today as adult learners, but everyone can learn. If given the support, the motivation, the inspiration, if they're willing to work, it is so amazing to see that growth. So that's kind of the time that most shaped me as an educator.
That's great. I'd be interested, actually. We haven't had anybody else on this show so far who has done Teach for America. I think that might be an interesting sort of sub-thread one of these days to kind of pull out and see who else has done that at ODU. So kind of building off that, maybe what are some of the techniques or strategies that you've used to create a classroom that supports the learning needs, as you say, of all your students?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think focusing on teaching the whole student is really important. And so everyone needs a little bit different kind of support, and there isn't just a one way to do that. The tools that I use for that, I learned after Teach for America. I also joined a nonprofit called the Institute for Research and Reform in Education. And I traveled around the country delivering professional developments for engagement, alignment, and rigor in the classroom. And then how do we measure the efficacy of teaching and make decisions to support that? And so I learned just a lot of engagement strategies through that are not necessarily unique to inclusive classroom, but I think the more that students engage with one another, engage with their teacher or professor, they feel much closer to them. They see that everyone cares about each other. And so developing a classroom culture where the students know that it isn't just a one-to-many experience where you have the one teacher in the front and you have all the students, but it's really a many-to-many experience where it's, yes, the teacher's there facilitating the relationships and the learning that happens socially through each other's experiences, their knowledge, their challenges. I use what I've learned here. I first learned at Elam, but really started developing it here at ODU is I use a lot of contract grading and ungrading methods in my classroom. I really like how it decouples the grading process from the learning process. And I've seen through the years a lot of traditional grading creating a barrier between the teacher and the student, that it becomes antagonistic, almost like, oh, you gave me that grade. And so now it's my job to convince you otherwise. And so I found contract grading to really help out with that process. I use something called a charter for compassion. And I wish I could attribute it to the right person right now, but I can't. I borrowed that from somebody else. And then I regularly teach lessons in my classes that aren't necessarily directly tied to the content, but absolutely fulfill the learning objectives in the class. So a lot of my learning objectives are about self-assessment, being able to reflect on your own performance and be able to self-assess without having somebody else tell you what your performance was, or a lot of reflective learning. And so even in my business policy and strategy course, which is the capstone course in the College of Business, I do a module on linguistic justice, and I talk about its origins, the importance of it. One of our goals in the College of Business is to develop inclusive leaders. It's in our strategic plan. And I've realized over time that if we want to develop leaders who are inclusive and supportive, we need to give our students practice having really difficult conversations, because those are not easy conversations. And just walking out of the school saying, hey, we want you to be an inclusive leader, have at it. That's hard to accomplish without that practice. So the modules on linguistic justice, while not necessarily directly associated in a linear fashion to business policy and strategy, is absolutely giving them the opportunity to have those hard conversations that if you're a strategic leader, you're having with your teams all the time and your stakeholders all the time. It may not be about linguistics and language, but it's going to be about issues where we have some pretty substantial differences.
Such wisdom that you shared, Jay. I like how you mentioned you adjust the instruction accordingly. Having seen you demonstrate some of that contract grading and ungrading was helpful for me. So thank you for expanding on that. The next question, do you have a particular assignment or classroom activity that you really enjoy doing with your students? If so, can you tell us about it and how students respond?
So I use a lot of Spencer Kagan's work, which is designed largely for elementary school rooms, but it's very applicable across the board. I learned those tools both within Teach for America, but then also with my time with the Institute for Research and Reform in Education. So I still use those. I love them. Kind of in my carpenter belt of tools that at any point in a class, I can just turn to one of them and use. I try to avoid lecture at all costs. It's a certain irony that I'm on a podcast right now, but I kind of always feel like no one really wants to hear me speak for that long. So especially in the classroom, so I try to limit that as much as I can. My favorite lesson, though, has to do with Porter's 5 Forces. And I love it because I use grand unification theory as a starting place for that. And specifically within grand unification theory, the idea that if we have students within a physics classroom and graduating with a physics degree, would you feel comfortable with them graduating if they didn't know how the force of gravity worked? And all my students in my room will say no, right? They're like, of course not. We wouldn't want people graduating with a physics degree from ODU if you didn't know that gravity is a function of mass and distance. And even if they don't remember that it's a function of mass and distance, we get to that point. And I drop dry erase markers in the room. I leave the room. I drop it in outside the room. I say, is it going to work the same way? And of course, everyone knows that it will. Well, with Porter's 5 forces, it's a fundamental theory and framework within strategy. And it's used to describe the attractiveness of the external environment in which you operate. And there are 5 forces that Porter introduced in this theory in the 70s. And essentially, I say, this is kind of like gravity is for physics students. If you graduate a college of business and you don't understand how the 5 forces work, that's like a physics student walking out without understanding how gravity works. Everyone that you interact with in your professional life that is going to be in strategic roles is going to appreciate this fundamental framework. And so it's a lot of fun because, I'm dropping dry erase markers, and then I ask like students, are you attracted to me? And then I say, well, I'm attracted to you. This is how we get to the point of, hey, gravity works everywhere because I've got mass, you've got mass, there's distance. Why don't we feel that gravity? It's because we have the earth around us, and the earth is what's pulling us towards. Well, in 5 forces framework, the same thing. There are all these factors that influence all these forces. Sometimes we don't feel them because there is this other thing at play that is so much stronger. The students then generally like it. And I just remind them, just think of me dropping a dry erase marker. You'll remember the 5 forces.
We actually had a sort of mini version of the 5 forces lesson with the libraries when Jay helped us create our strategic plan, and understanding that those essential forces was really kind of key, I think, to helping us come up with a really solid plan. And while you were talking, I went and looked up. It looks like Karen Armstrong maybe was the person that the Charter for Compassion. Is that sound?
That sounds right.
Coming out of a
I do footnote it in my syllabi.
Coming out of a TED Talk, maybe she did in 2008, and it's kind of grown since then, become its own thing. That's courtesy of Wikipedia. Don't get mad if I'm way off. All right, moving along. So how do you adapt your teaching strategies when you transition between in-person and online formats? And are there key differences in your approach?
So yes and no. The first time I taught online was during the pandemic, probably like a lot of people. And when that happened, I taught asynchronously online. And so my first transition to teaching online was through synchronous formats. And there are certainly differences there, but most of the engagement strategies that I would use, I still used in the online format. By that point, I had stopped using slides in my classroom. So that was a difficult thing because then I had to go back to slides a little bit. But then I found DocuCams, and I just started using DocuCams connected to my computer and could just use pieces of paper as my dry erase board. But in general, in the synchronous and asynchronous, I still like being in person. I think there's something that you can't replicate without having that in-person experience. The big difference was asynchronous formats, because I think a lot is lost there. And one thing that I've done in my classrooms, and I've spoken about before, is I use learning teams as a means through which to ensure that the students are still engaged socially in their learning in a synchronous way, even if it's an asynchronous course. So I don't teach asynchronous courses that are kind of designed in such a way as a learn at your own pace type course. Most of the content that I'm teaching and most of the research that we know about how brains develop and how memory solidifies is fairly inconsistent with a learn at your own pace format, in my opinion. You have to give downtime, a lot of reflection time, a lot of time for it to sit. So even though in the asynchronous courses I teach, the students still need to meet every week for about, if it's totally asynchronous, my requirement is an hour a week with your learning team. Totally up to them for when they want to meet. So my own schedule looks a little bit like Swiss cheese because I have 14 teams that are all meeting at different times. And I try to pop into those team meetings once or twice a semester. It's really cool. Zoom has a new AI companion, which I've used now with them. And it's amazing because when they're done with their meeting, they forward it on to their team members. I get copied on it, and then I get to read a summary of their discussion, follow up with them if need be. So that's probably My one strongest suggestion for folks who teach asynchronous online, don't be afraid to ask your students to interact with one another. I would say the vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean like 90 to 95% of my students love that aspect about the course. I still have some students who do not, that they signed up for an online course because they did not want to have to interact with others, but that doesn't mean it's not healthy for them to.
With these learning teams, just curious, Jay, are these mostly graduate students or undergraduate students that you're doing these interactions with?
These are undergraduate students. So I teach undergraduate online, and then I teach PhD students, but I don't actually teach in our MBA program right now. But they're all undergrads. A lot of them are adult learners, though. But I've found that at least in my asynchronous courses versus my in-person ones, I ask before the semester starts questions about a lot of things in a pre-class survey, but also, do you work? How many hours do you work? Where do you work? How many credits are you taking? Do you care for children, parents, grandparents, things that would occupy time and are important? And I don't see a big difference between my in-person and my asynchronous students. I will say, though, I teach a lot of evening classes, so that may be why. So I normally am teaching in person between the hours of 4 and 10 p.m.
Thank you. And our last formal question, how do you stay up to date on the latest teaching strategies and tools? And can you recommend any resources that have helped you in your teaching journey?
So I love the resources ODU has. It was not something I was fully appreciative of when I interviewed here and decided to come here. But I have been really in awe of the breadth of opportunities and the depth of knowledge and expertise we have here for everyone. So I try to attend as many of the Center for Faculty Development events as I can. I've found them all to be incredible resources. I've made great connections across campus. That's how I learned more about contract grading. I first was introduced to it at Elon, but really didn't fully appreciate it until I got here. In ungrading, I've worked on my ability to teach writing better through that. In the Strome College of Business, we do annual teaching moments, which is it's a great opportunity where anyone who wants to just shares 3 to 5 minutes. What's one thing that's working well in your classroom? So I found that to be very useful too. So I try to engage in those. I meet with colleagues regularly. Professor Mike Stein in accounting and we started a little book club last year on common sense teaching. Mike introduced it to me and I said, why don't we just get other people who might want to talk about this too? We're getting coffee anyway. Let's just figure this out. I'm currently reading the Teaching with AI, as a part of the university efforts. And I'm also reading a book on NeuroTeach. It's called right now. So I just generally have a lot of reading and then trying to attend events when I can, talking to colleagues.
That's excellent. Yeah, I'm with you. There's just a tremendous depth of resources available at the university and lots of people who are just willing and able to share their expertise. So to wrap up the conversation, we have a series of just kind of some quick, hopefully fun questions. We like to ask our guests just to get to know them a little bit better. So for the first one, and you just mentioned a couple, but what was the last book you read or listened to, and would you recommend it?
The Last Hero, Life of Henry Aaron. It's a biography. I would absolutely recommend it. I'm a huge baseball fan. So anytime I get an opportunity to read about baseball, and his life story is just like many of the players of his era who were integrating baseball at that time, it's tragic, but also just powerful. It's a great book. He also played in Milwaukee, where I grew up. He played for the Milwaukee Braves and then later for the Brewers before he went back to Atlanta for the Braves. So I also wanted to read about that. Because of that.
That's great. Book. Is he one of your top players of all time?
For sure. In terms of, in retrospect, growing up, my favorite player was Rickey Henderson. And I read his biography, which was also written by the same author, Howard Bryant. So I read his, I was like, this is amazing. And then I realized he had written one about Henry Aaron. So I was like, I need to pick that up.
All right. So join us for our podcast spinoff all about baseball biographies. Coming soon from the Center for Faculty Development and the libraries. All right. Second question is, how do you unwind after a long day?
Find space to myself, frankly. So I'm an introvert. I tell my students this in the first day. I'm an introvert. And That doesn't mean I don't like being around people. If you know the difference between an extrovert and introvert, it has nothing to do with enjoying people. It's just when I'm in a classroom and I teach, I'm giving everything I have. And by the time I'm done teaching, I'm exhausted. And the last thing I want to do is actually talk to people. So I find some time to myself, whether it's on the car ride, I might listen to a podcast, but go for a walk. I love going to the park, Landing State Park. If I can have time there, that's what I like to do.
Nice. And last one is, what do you like best about your role and work as an educator?
Teaching is a gift. It is the greatest profession in the world. I mean, I love my research too. When I taught in Teach for America and I taught high school math, I really loved it. The students were just so inspiring and amazing. I also realized that I couldn't do that for the rest of my life because I needed the additional stimulation associated with kind of the curiosity of asking and answering questions. So being a professor has really been amazing from that standpoint. I love that every year I watch students come to my classroom who do work almost full time, and are caring for their children or parents or grandparents. And they recognize the importance of education and a degree, and they're going to work through so much strife to get to that point. And that just, to me, makes me want to work harder. And I love it. It's just, again, I can't believe we get paid for this. I need to get paid for it, but I can't believe we get paid for it. It's pretty amazing.
Well, Jay, thank you so much. Thank you, listeners. And thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Pedagogy in Practice is an official podcast of Old Dominion University, the Center for Faculty Development, and ODU Libraries. Your co-hosts are Crystal Kinlock-Taylor and Tim Hackman. Original music composed and copyrighted by Richard Sigwald. Find and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Visit ODU's Center for Faculty Development homepage for more information about the show and for more information about ODU. Thanks for listening.